Hey there, Skywatchers. Before you click away thinking this is another grainy footage conspiracy rabbit hole, hold up. We're talking fighter pilots, commercial airline captains, and military personnel who've got way more to lose than gain by speaking up. Today we're diving into UFO encounters that span from South American jungles to Alaskan mountains, featuring Soviet jets that got absolutely schooled, mid-air mysteries at 35,000 feet, and trained observers witnessing things that, according to our current understanding of physics, just shouldn't exist. And here's the kicker, they've been trying to tell us about it for decades. So real quick, smash that like button if you're ready to have your mind properly bent, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to know who's brave enough to dive into this particular rabbit hole with me. Are you team, there's a rational explanation, or team, okay, something weird is definitely happening up there? Let me know. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about what's flying around up there, because the stories we're about to walk through aren't from random people on the internet. They're from the folks we trust to fly us safely from point A to point B. And trust me, what they've seen is going to make you look at the sky a little differently next time you're on a plane. Let's roll. Now, before we dive headfirst into stories about Soviet jets getting absolutely humiliated by mystery objects and commercial pilots having existential crises at cruising altitude, we need to talk about something that changed the entire game when it comes to studying these things. And no, I'm not talking about better cameras, though honestly, that would help considering every UFO video looks like it was filmed on a potato from 1987. I'm talking about a framework, a systematic approach to understanding what we're actually looking at, when trained observers report something that makes absolutely zero sense, according to our current understanding of physics and aerodynamics. Enter Lou Elizondo, former intelligence officer who ran a Pentagon program you definitely weren't supposed to know about until 2017, when the whole thing went public and everyone collectively lost their minds. Elizondo and his team spent years analysing UFO encounters, or as the government prefers to call them now, unidentified aerial phenomena, because apparently UFO sounds too sci-fi, and we need to maintain our professional dignity while discussing objects that literally break the laws of physics. And here's what they figured out after examining thousands of reports from military personnel, commercial pilots, and radar operators who all saw variations of the same impossible things. These objects consistently display 5 characteristics. Not random descriptions from panicked witnesses who saw something weird after too many drinks at the airport bar. Measurable, repeatable phenomena that show up across decades, across continents, and across completely independent witness accounts who had no way of coordinating their stories. They call these the 5 observables, and once you understand them, you can't unsee them. Every story we're going to discuss from here on out is going to check multiple boxes on this list, and that's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. These aren't just cool party facts to impress your friends with, though they absolutely work for that purpose. These observables are the difference between I saw something weird and I witnessed technology that shouldn't exist on this planet. So let's break them down one by one, because understanding this framework is going to be your new lens for viewing every encounter that follows, and trust me, you're going to need it. Observable number 1, anti-gravity lift. Now I know what you're thinking. Anti-gravity sounds like something out of a Marvel movie, right up there with vibranium and magic hammers. Except here's the thing. Witnesses consistently report these objects hovering, completely motionless, with no visible means of propulsion. No helicopter rotors chopping away, no jet engines screaming, no wings generating lift, no rocket exhaust burning everything underneath to a crisp. Just floating there like someone hit the pause button on reality. And we're not talking about hovering a few feet off the ground for a couple seconds. We're talking sustained flight at various altitudes with zero detectable propulsion system. Naturally, this violates pretty much everything we know about how things fly, which is generally considered a red flag when you're trying to figure out what something is. Our helicopters need those massive rotors beating the air into submission just to stay aloft. Our jets need constant thrust pushing them forward. Our drones need propellers or ducted fans, and even those make noise and create air disturbance you can measure. These objects, nothing. Just sitting there in the sky like gravity is more of a suggestion than a law. Unfortunately for our understanding of physics, gravity doesn't usually work that way, which makes this particular observable deeply uncomfortable for aerospace engineers who spent years in school learning how things are supposed to fly. Observable number 2, instantaneous acceleration. And when I say instantaneous, I mean 0 to ludicrous speed in a blink, with no gradual build-up, no runway needed, no visible energy expenditure that would turn the surrounding air into a fireball. Picture this. You're watching something hovering motionless in the sky. Maybe you're thinking it's a drone or a weather balloon or whatever helps you sleep at night, and then suddenly, and I mean in a fraction of a second, it's gone. Not flying away in a blur, not gradually picking up speed like a car merging onto a highway, just instantaneously somewhere else, like someone teleported it across the sky. Witnesses describe objects going from 0 to thousands of miles per hour in under a second, then stopping just as abruptly with no deceleration period. Now, if you've ever been in a car that accelerated too quickly or hit the brakes too hard, you know what G-forces feel like, that sensation of being pushed back into your seat or thrown forward against your seatbelt. Fighter pilots train extensively to handle high G-forces, and even with special suits and techniques, sustained forces above 9 Gs will make a human pilot black out as blood drains from their brain. The acceleration witnesses describe would generate G-forces that would instantly turn any biological pilot into a very disturbed paste. We're talking hundreds of Gs, maybe thousands, sustained in a way that would liquefy internal organs and shatter bones if there was anything biological inside. But these objects do it repeatedly, no problem, like the laws of inertia took a personal day off. Which raises some interesting questions about what's controlling these things, because it's definitely not limited by human physiology. Observable number 3, hypersonic velocities without signatures. This one's particularly fun because it combines two things that shouldn't go together: extreme speed and complete stealth. Let's talk about what happens when you push something through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, which generally means anything over 5 times the speed of sound, or roughly 3,800 miles per hour. First, you get a sonic boom, that distinctive explosive sound caused by shock waves as you break through the sound barrier. Everyone within miles hears it, windows rattle, car alarms go off, and generally it's about as subtle as a rock concert in a library. Second, you get a heat signature that lights up infrared sensors like a Christmas tree, because all that air friction generates massive amounts of heat. We're talking thousands of degrees, hot enough that spacecraft returning from orbit need specialized heat shields just to survive re-entry. Third, you create a radar signature because, well, you're a large object moving through the atmosphere and radar is specifically designed to detect that. These objects. They move at speeds that should create all 3 signatures: sonic booms, heat signatures, radar returns, and yet witnesses consistently report either reduced signatures or none at all. Objects moving at speeds that should shatter windows for miles around, and the only people who notice are the ones looking directly at them. No sonic boom shaking buildings, no heat bloom on infrared, and sometimes even radar can't get a solid lock despite the thing being right there in visual range. It's like watching someone sprint through a swimming pool without creating any ripples or splashes, which would be impressive if it wasn't completely impossible according to everything we know about physics and fluid dynamics. Observable number 4, low observability or cloaking. Now we've all seen stealth aircraft, the B-2 bomber, the F-22, the F-35, expensive pieces of engineering designed to minimize radar cross-section through careful shaping and specialized materials. They're impressively stealthy for human technology, but they're not invisible. They still show up on radar under certain conditions, they still create heat signatures, and you can definitely see them with the naked eye if they're close enough and the lighting is right. These unidentified objects take it several steps further. Witnesses report objects that seem to fade in and out of visibility, not because they're moving behind clouds or distance is making them hard to see, but because their actual physical appearance seems to change. Some reports describe objects that appear translucent or partially transparent, like looking at something through frosted glass. Others report objects that seem to shimmer or warp the air around them, similar to heat distortion but more pronounced. And then there are the cases where objects completely vanish from both visual sight and radar simultaneously, not by flying away, but by simply ceasing to be detectable. It's like they're operating with some kind of cloaking technology that makes the invisibility cloak from Harry Potter look like a cheap party trick. Pilots will be tracking something on radar and visual simultaneously, and then it just disappears, not off their screen because it flew out of range, but just gone, like someone flipped a switch. And before you say, well, maybe it was just sensor malfunction, Remember, we're talking about military-grade sensors that are specifically designed not to malfunction during critical operations, operated by trained personnel who know the difference. Between a technical glitch and something actually vanishing, this isn't someone's phone camera acting up. This is professional equipment having an existential crisis. Observable number 5, trans-medium travel. This is the one that really makes aerospace engineers question their life choices, because it involves objects moving seamlessly between different mediums, air, water, space, without any apparent adjustment period or specialized equipment. Let me put this in perspective. When we want to move from air to water, we need submarines with pressurized hulls, ballast tanks, specialized propulsion systems, and a whole lot of engineering to handle the pressure differences and density changes. When we want to go from air to space, we need rockets, heat shields, and enough fuel to basically strap ourselves to a controlled explosion. These transitions require massive amounts of energy and completely different vehicle designs because the physics of moving through air versus water versus vacuum are fundamentally different. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air, which means you need completely different propulsion and control systems. Space is a vacuum with no atmosphere, which means conventional propulsion doesn't work at all without something to push against. Yet witnesses report objects that dive into the ocean at high speed without creating the massive splash you'd expect, or ascending from the ocean into the air without any visible adjustment, no water streaming off, no change in behavior or flight. Characteristics. Some reports describe objects detected on sonar underwater, then breaking the surface and continuing into the air without slowing down or changing course. Like the medium they're moving through is completely irrelevant. Navy personnel have tracked objects on sonar moving at speeds that would create cavitation bubbles and basically boil the water around them, except they don't. They just glide through like they're not even touching the water. And then they pop up into the air and continue at similar speeds, completely unbothered by the fact that they just changed mediums in a way that should require massive amounts of energy and specialized systems. It's like watching a fish jump out of water, sprout wings, and fly into space without breaking a sweat, which would be entertaining if it wasn't completely absurd. Now here's why these 5 observables matter, and why Elizondo's team spent so much time defining them precisely. Before this framework existed, every UFO report was just another story, another claim that could be dismissed as misidentification, sensor errors, or someone seeing Venus through swamp gas on a particularly weird night. But when you start looking at reports through the lens of these 5 characteristics, patterns emerge. Multiple independent witnesses across different time periods and locations reporting the same impossible flight characteristics. Military sensors confirming what pilots are seeing with their own eyes, radar data backing up visual observations, infrared cameras capturing objects that shouldn't be able to fly the way they're flying. This isn't about believing random stories anymore. This is about documented observations from trained professionals using professional equipment, all describing technology that exhibits these same 5 characteristics over and over again. And here's the uncomfortable part. We can't replicate any of these observables with current human technology, let alone all 5 simultaneously. Sure, we've got drones that can hover quietly, but not without visible propulsion systems and certainly not for extended periods at high altitude. We've got aircraft that can accelerate quickly, but not instantaneously, and not without creating massive G-forces that would require specialized systems to handle. We've got hypersonic missiles that can reach incredible speeds, but they create sonic booms you can hear from miles away, and heat signatures visible from space. We've got stealth aircraft with reduced radar signatures, but nothing that can become completely invisible at will. And as for trans-medium travel, we're not even close. Our submarines can't fly and our aircraft can't swim, and the engineering required to build something that could do both would be so complex and expensive that only a handful of nations could even attempt it, and they definitely haven't succeeded in creating anything that matches what's being reported. So when we talk about the stories coming up, the Soviet jet that got schooled by something that shouldn't exist, the commercial pilot who watched physics take a coffee break, the contractors in Alaska who witnessed technology that made their navigation beacon look like Stone Age equipment, keep these 5 observables in mind. Anti-gravity lift, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speeds without signatures, low observability, and trans-medium travel. These aren't just cool descriptions from science fiction. These are measurable characteristics that show up consistently in encounter after encounter, witnessed by people whose entire careers depend on accurate observation and reporting. Fighter pilots who train for years to identify aircraft and assess threats. Commercial airline captains who log thousands of flight hours and know what belongs in the sky and what doesn't. Radar operators who monitor screens for hours and can tell the difference between a flock of birds, a weather balloon, and something that's actively mocking our understanding of physics. The framework Elizondo established isn't about proving these objects are extraterrestrial or interdimensional, or time-traveling tourists from the future coming back to watch us fumble around with primitive technology. It's about establishing objective criteria for saying, okay, regardless of what this is or where it's from, it's doing things that our current technology and understanding of physics says shouldn't be possible. It's about moving the conversation from do these things exist to what are these things and how are they doing what they're doing. Because once you accept that multiple credible witnesses using professional equipment are consistently observing the same impossible flight characteristics, the question isn't whether something weird is happening. The question becomes what's happening and why. And that's the lens we're going to use for everything that follows. When you hear about a Peruvian Air Force pilot emptying his guns at something that absorbed the bullets like a sponge and then accelerated to speeds that would make our fastest jets look like they're standing still, you're going to recognize observables 2 and 3. When you hear about commercial pilots reporting objects that appear and disappear seemingly at will, you'll recognize observable 4. When you hear about objects diving into the ocean and continuing their journey underwater before popping back up into the air, you'll recognize observable 5. These patterns exist, they repeat across time and geography, and they're documented by people who have absolutely nothing to gain and potentially everything to lose by reporting them. So before we get into the specific encounters that are going to make you look at the sky differently next time you're on a flight, understand that this framework exists. The 5 observables aren't random characteristics pulled from imagination. They're the result of systematic analysis of thousands of reports from credible witnesses using professional equipment. They're the common denominators that show up when you strip away the speculation and focus on what's actually being observed and measured. And they're about to become very familiar as we walk through encounters that check multiple boxes on this list. Encounters that suggest whatever's flying around up there isn't limited by the same physics and engineering constraints that keep our aircraft firmly planted in the realm of the possible. The question isn't whether you believe in UFOs. Belief isn't required here. The question is whether you're ready to look at documented observations from credible witnesses and accept that something is happening that we don't fully understand yet. And if you're still watching at this point, I'm going to assume the answer is yes, which means you're ready for what comes next. Because we're about to discuss specific encounters where these 5 observables show up in combinations that make aerospace engineers very uncomfortable and leave pilots with stories they're not supposed to tell but can't keep quiet about anymore. And it all starts with a young Peruvian Air Force pilot on a sunny morning in 1980, standing at attention with thousands of his colleagues, having absolutely no idea that he's about to have an encounter that will define the rest of his life and contribute to a global pattern that we're still trying to understand decades later. So now that you understand the framework, the 5 observables that separate I saw something weird from I witnessed technology that shouldn't exist, let's talk about geography. Because here's something that's going to mess with your Area 51 obsession. While everyone in the United States is fixated on a patch of Nevada desert and a decades-old incident in Roswell, New Mexico, there's an entire continent that's been experiencing UFO encounters at a rate that makes North American sightings look like a quiet Tuesday. I'm talking about South America, the UFO hotspot that nobody seems to talk about despite having some of the most well-documented, officially investigated, and frankly bizarre encounters on record. And before you assume this is just because they've got better storytelling down there or something condescending like that, understand that we're talking about government agencies, military personnel, and official investigations backed by radar data and multiple witnesses. This isn't folklore. This is documented phenomenon that's been happening for decades while the rest of the world was looking the other way. Let's start with some numbers that are going to make you reconsider your travel plans. Chile reportedly has the highest number of UFO sightings per capita in the world, which is a statistic that sounds impressive until you realize what it actually means. We're not talking about a country with a population of 500 people, where 3 sightings makes them the world leader. Chile has over 19 million people, and they're seeing unexplained aerial phenomena at a rate that prompted their government to do something most governments refuse to do: take it seriously and investigate systematically. In 1997, Chile established an official government agency called the Committee for the Study of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena, which operates under their equivalent of the FAA, and is staffed by actual scientists, military personnel, and aviation experts, whose job is to analyze UFO reports. Not dismiss them, not laugh them off, not file them in a drawer labeled crazy people, actually investigate them using scientific methodology. Because when you're getting reports from commercial pilots, military radar operators, and coastal observation stations at a frequency that suggests this isn't just random misidentification, you either take it seriously or accept that your airspace has unidentified traffic you're choosing to ignore, which isn't exactly reassuring for a country that takes aviation safety seriously. Peru isn't far behind in the numbers game, with thousands of documented encounters spanning decades and involving everyone from military pilots to civilian witnesses to entire towns, watching objects perform maneuvers that violate basic physics. The Peruvian Air Force has officially investigated hundreds of these cases, and unlike many countries that classify everything and pretend it doesn't exist, they've actually released files and acknowledged that yes, they're seeing things they can't explain, and yes, it's concerning. Argentina has similar numbers and a similar approach: official investigation, documented cases, military acknowledgement that something unexplained is happening in their airspace with disturbing frequency. We're talking about 3 major South American countries, geographically massive regions spanning thousands of miles of coastline, jungle, mountains, and everything in between, all reporting the same types of encounters, featuring the same impossible flight characteristics. This isn't a localized phenomenon limited to one city or one region. This is continental-scale weirdness that's been documented, investigated, and confirmed by official agencies whose credibility depends on accurate reporting. So what makes South America so special that these objects seem to show up there more frequently than anywhere else? Well, there are theories, and naturally none of them are particularly comforting. First theory: geography and natural resources. South America has the Amazon rainforest, the longest mountain range on the planet in the Andes, massive coastlines along both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and some of the most resource-rich territory on Earth. If you were an intelligence-gathering operation, whether human, non-human, or something in between, this would be prime real estate for observation. Remote areas with limited human population where you can operate without constant scrutiny, combined with major urban centers, military installations, and industrial operations that would be strategically interesting. Unfortunately for our collective peace of mind, this makes South America an ideal location for whoever or whatever is piloting these objects to conduct long-term observation without attracting the same level of attention they'd get buzzing around Los Angeles or New York City. Second theory: the Pacific Ocean. Chile has over 4,000 miles of coastline along the Pacific. Peru has about 1,500 miles, and if you extend down to include Ecuador and Colombia, you're looking at one of the longest continuous coastlines on the planet, directly facing the largest ocean on Earth. Multiple reports from South America involve objects emerging from the ocean or descending into it, which ties directly into that fifth observable we discussed: trans-medium travel. If these objects are operating from underwater bases or using the ocean as a transit route, the Pacific coast of South America provides thousands of miles of deep water with relatively sparse naval coverage compared to, say, the heavily monitored waters around North America or Europe. You could theoretically operate a small underwater city off the coast of Chile, and nobody would notice until you decided to pop up and say hello to a fishing boat. The ocean is massive, largely unexplored, and provides natural cover for anything that doesn't want to be found. Naturally, this theory makes oceanographers and marine biologists very uncomfortable, because it suggests we might not be alone in those deep waters, which is somehow more unsettling than the idea of visitors from space. Third theory, and this one's going to sound wild, but stick with me: South America's position relative to Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric conditions. The continent sits in a unique position where the Earth's magnetic field exhibits some unusual characteristics, particularly in the South Atlantic anomaly, a region where the planet's magnetic field is significantly weaker than surrounding areas. This anomaly allows higher levels of radiation to reach lower altitudes and creates unusual electromagnetic conditions that some researchers think might be relevant to how these objects operate or why they're attracted to certain regions. If the propulsion system or navigation system used by these objects interacts with magnetic fields in ways we don't understand yet, regions with unusual magnetic characteristics might be more favourable for their operations. It's speculative, absolutely, but it's the kind of speculation that at least tries to apply scientific thinking to an otherwise inexplicable pattern. Plus it sounds slightly less terrifying than they're just really interested in watching us specifically, which is the alternative explanation nobody wants to consider too closely. But here's what really sets South America apart from other regions with high UFO activity: transparency. The military forces down there are significantly more willing to talk about this stuff than their counterparts in North America or Europe, and that openness has created a documented record that's frankly unprecedented. When a Peruvian Air Force pilot has an encounter, there's an official investigation. When Chilean radar picks up unexplained objects, there's an official report. When Argentine military personnel witness something anomalous, there's documentation and analysis rather than denial and classification. This isn't because South American militaries are less professional or less security conscious. It's because they've apparently decided that pretending the problem doesn't exist is worse than acknowledging it and trying to understand it. Which is a refreshingly rational approach that makes the rest of the world's "let's just classify everything and hope nobody notices" strategy look increasingly absurd. Why the difference in approach? Several factors are at play here. First, South American countries generally don't have the same level of classified aerospace programs as the United States or Russia, which means they're less worried about reports being mistaken for secret military projects. When the US military gets a UFO report, there's always the concern that witnesses are seeing classified experimental aircraft, which creates pressure to deny and classify rather than investigate openly. South American countries don't have that same concern because they know exactly what aircraft they have, and if something shows up that isn't theirs, it's definitively not theirs. Second, the frequency and quality of encounters in South America has reached a level where denial becomes untenable. When you've got thousands of reports from credible witnesses backed by radar data and multiple independent observations, continuing to pretend nothing's happening just makes you look incompetent rather than secure. Better to acknowledge the phenomenon and study it than maintain a facade that everyone knows is false. Third, and this is important, there's less stigma attached to reporting and investigating UFOs in South American culture compared to North American or European culture. In the United States, reporting a UFO encounter can damage your career, your reputation, and your credibility even if you're a trained military pilot with decades of experience. In South America, it's treated more like reporting any other aviation safety concern, something that needs documentation and investigation regardless of how weird it is. This cultural difference creates an environment where pilots, radar operators, and military personnel feel safe reporting what they see, rather than staying silent to protect their careers. The result is a much more complete picture of what's actually happening in South American airspace, which in turn reveals patterns that might exist elsewhere, but remain hidden under layers of denial and classification. And those patterns are deeply weird. Reports from South America consistently describe objects displaying all 5 observables we discussed earlier: anti-gravity lift, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speeds without signatures, low observability, and transmedium travel. Objects hovering over the Andes Mountains at altitudes where the air is too thin for conventional aircraft to generate lift. Objects accelerating from stationary to thousands of miles per hour over the Amazon rainforest, without creating sonic booms that would echo for miles. Objects diving into the Pacific Ocean off the Chilean coast and continuing to move at high speed underwater before emerging hours later hundreds of miles away. Objects appearing on radar, then vanishing, then reappearing in completely different locations with no transit time in between. These aren't isolated incidents. These are repeated observations documented by military and civilian authorities across multiple countries over multiple decades. The Chile case files alone read like a greatest hits collection of impossible physics. Commercial pilots reporting objects pacing their aircraft at cruising altitude, matching their speed and altitude perfectly for minutes at a time before accelerating away at speeds that would require technology we don't possess. Navy vessels tracking objects on sonar that move underwater faster than any submarine humanity has ever built, with no detectable propulsion system and no thermal signature. Ground radar operators watching objects descend vertically from high altitude, stop completely at ground level, then shoot back up to altitude in seconds flat. And all of this is documented, investigated by official agencies, and released to the public because Chile apparently decided that transparency is more important than maintaining comfortable lies. Which is admirable, even if the truth they're revealing is substantially more disturbing than the lies might have been. Peru has similar documentation, with the added bonus of direct military encounters that escalated to active engagement. Pilots ordered to intercept unknown objects, firing weapons at them, and discovering very quickly that whatever they're shooting at doesn't particularly care about bullets or missiles. These aren't theoretical observations from a distance. These are close-range encounters where pilots got close enough to see details, where radar got precise locks on target speed and trajectory, where the limitations of human technology got demonstrated in ways that are both humbling and terrifying. We'll dive deeper into one of those encounters in the next chapter, but understand that Peru's willingness to document and release these cases has created a historical record that's invaluable for anyone trying to understand what's actually happening. In global airspace, Argentina rounds out the South American trifecta with its own extensive documentation of encounters, including multiple cases of objects appearing over military installations, airports, and population centres. Their air force has investigated hundreds of reports using systematic methodology that includes radar analysis, witness interviews, and physical evidence collection where available. The resulting files paint a picture of persistent aerial activity that defies conventional explanation and suggests coordinated intelligence rather than random phenomenon. Objects appearing at strategic locations, demonstrating awareness of military response, and exhibiting flight characteristics that suggest technological sophistication beyond current human capabilities. It's the kind of pattern that makes military strategists very nervous because it implies potential surveillance or reconnaissance operations being conducted in sovereign airspace without permission and without any ability to prevent or intercept. Now you might be thinking, okay, but couldn't these just be misidentifications of natural phenomena or conventional aircraft? Valid question, and the answer is maybe for some cases, but definitely not for all of them, and probably not for most of them. The agencies investigating these reports aren't staffed by enthusiasts looking to confirm their beliefs. They're staffed by skeptical professionals whose job is to identify conventional explanations and eliminate anomalous reports that can be explained through normal means. They've got access to flight logs, weather data, astronomical charts, and everything else needed to rule out Venus, weather balloons, commercial aircraft, experimental drones, and all the usual suspects that account for the vast majority of UFO reports worldwide. The cases that remain after that filtering process, the ones that end up in official files as genuinely unexplained, are the ones that don't fit any conventional explanation and exhibit characteristics that suggest advanced technology operating in ways we don't understand. What makes South America particularly valuable for understanding this global phenomenon is that the documented cases there provide a baseline for comparison with sightings elsewhere. When a North American pilot reports an encounter but the details remain classified, we can look at similar South American cases to understand what might have been observed. When European military personnel report unexplained radar contacts but official channels deny anything happened, we can reference South American investigations that dealt with similar situations openly and see what conclusions professional investigators reached. The transparency in South America creates a research foundation that helps validate reports from less transparent regions, building a more complete picture of worldwide aerial activity that would otherwise remain fragmented and impossible to analyze systematically. And here's the really interesting part. The encounters in South America aren't random. They cluster around certain geographic features, certain types of installations, and certain periods of heightened activity that suggest pattern and purpose rather than chance. Coastal areas see more ocean-related encounters. Mountain regions see more hovering and low-altitude observations. Areas near military installations see more high-speed intercepts and evasive maneuvers. This isn't the distribution you'd expect from random natural phenomena or misidentified conventional aircraft. This is a pattern suggesting intelligence, strategy, and specific operational objectives. Whatever these objects are, wherever they're from, they're not just wandering around aimlessly hoping to be seen. They're conducting operations with apparent purpose in regions that offer strategic value for observation, and South America's unique combination of geography, resources, and relative isolation makes it an ideal location for those operations. So when we talk about why South America matters in the broader UFO discussion, it's not just because they have lots of sightings. It's because they have lots of well-documented, officially investigated, multiply-witness sightings that have been studied by professional agencies and released to the public in ways that allow systematic analysis. It's because the military and government institutions there have chosen transparency over secrecy, creating a documented record that reveals patterns and characteristics we wouldn't see otherwise. And it's because those patterns suggest this isn't a local phenomenon limited to one continent. It's a global phenomenon that happens to be more visible in South America because the reporting and investigation infrastructure there actually works the way it should instead of being buried under classification and denial. Which brings us to the next logical question. If these encounters are happening in South America at documented rates that seem impossibly high, what about everywhere else? Are similar encounters happening in North America, Europe, Asia, and just not being reported or investigated with the same transparency? The answer, based on leaked documents, whistleblower testimony, and occasional official admissions, appears to be yes. The phenomenon is global, the patterns are consistent, and the only real difference is whether governments choose to acknowledge it openly or maintain the increasingly absurd pretense that nothing unusual is happening in their airspace. South America chose acknowledgement, and the result is a dataset that's invaluable for understanding what might be one of the most significant ongoing phenomena in modern history. So keep South America in mind as we move forward, because the encounters we're about to discuss, encounters that sound impossible until you see the documentation, all happened in this region, where transparency has created visibility into something the rest of the world is still trying to pretend doesn't exist. And the first of those encounters involves a young Peruvian Air Force lieutenant, a Soviet-made fighter jet, and an object that was about to demonstrate very conclusively that all 5 observables we discussed aren't just theoretical categories. They're real characteristics of real objects doing real things that shouldn't be possible. That encounter happened on a clear morning in 1980 at an airbase in southern Peru, and nearly 2,000 people were about to witness something that would change how we think about what's possible in our skies. April 1980, southern Peru, and the morning starts like any other military morning, which is to say, early, regimented, and with the kind of discipline that makes civilian life look like permanent vacation. La Jolla Air Base, tucked away in the Arequipa region where the Andes meet the coastal desert, is conducting routine formations. Nearly 1,800 military personnel standing at attention in the kind of heat that makes you question your career choices, going through the motions of standard military ceremony. Not exactly the setting where you'd expect history to be made, but then again, the most significant moments rarely announce themselves with dramatic music and warning labels. This particular morning is about to become one of those moments that gets filed under things that shouldn't be possible but definitely happened anyway, witnessed by enough people that denial becomes statistically impossible. Lieutenant Javier Rodrigo Castillo, a young fighter pilot who probably woke up that morning thinking his biggest challenge would be not falling asleep during the formation ceremony, is about to have the most significant 22 minutes of his flying career. He's qualified on the Sukhoi Su-22, a Soviet-made fighter bomber that Peru acquired during a period when the Cold War made for interesting international partnerships and even more interesting aircraft acquisitions. The Su-22 is fast. We're talking capable of speeds over 1,400 miles per hour at altitude, which in 1980 puts it among the faster operational aircraft on the planet. It's also heavily armed with 30mm cannons designed to shred whatever they're pointed at, because the Soviets didn't do subtle when it came to weapons design. Castillo is comfortable in this aircraft, trained extensively on its systems, confident in its capabilities. That confidence is about to get thoroughly tested by something that makes his advanced fighter jet look like a bicycle with wings. The formation is interrupted by something appearing on the base radar that shouldn't be there, an unknown object hovering at approximately 1,800 feet directly over the base perimeter. Not flying past, not at high altitude minding its own business, but hovering, right there, over a military installation, which is generally considered poor form when you're an unidentified aircraft in restricted airspace, roughly equivalent to walking into someone's house uninvited and parking yourself in their living room. Tower operators try to establish radio contact. Nothing. They check their flight logs for scheduled traffic. Nothing matches. They contact civilian aviation authorities to see if someone got lost or filed the world's worst flight plan. Negative. So now they've got an object of unknown origin hovering over a military base with nearly 2,000 personnel in formation below, and the protocol for this situation is pretty straightforward. Scramble a fighter, identify the object, and if it doesn't belong there and won't leave, deal with it accordingly. Castillo gets the call: scramble, intercept, identify, standard procedure, except there's an edge to the command that suggests this isn't standard at all. He's airborne in minutes, the Su-22 responding beautifully as he climbs toward the coordinates provided by ground radar. And here's where the story shifts from routine intercept to what in the actual physics-defying nonsense is happening right now. As Castillo approaches the target area, he gets visual confirmation of something that his training absolutely did not prepare him for. Hovering at roughly 1,800 feet is a metallic sphere, approximately 30 feet in diameter based on his estimation, with no visible propulsion system, no wings, no rotors, no exhaust, nothing that explains how it's staying in the air. Just floating there like gravity sent in a sick note and took the day off. The surface appears seamless. No panel lines, no access hatches, no markings, no windows if there are occupants inside wondering why a Soviet-made fighter jet is suddenly very interested in their morning. Observable number 1 right there, anti-gravity lift being demonstrated in front of 1,800 ground witnesses and one increasingly concerned fighter pilot. Ground control confirms they're tracking both aircraft on radar. Castillo's jet shows up exactly as expected, and the unknown object shows up as a solid return that's definitely not a bird, not a weather balloon, and not any conventional aircraft in their database. Castillo closes to within roughly 1,500 feet, trying to get a better look and establish whether this thing is friendly, neutral, or about to become a problem. The object remains stationary, apparently unbothered by the armed fighter jet circling it like a confused guard dog encountering something completely outside its experience. Ground control issues the next logical order in the chain of military escalation. If it won't identify itself and won't leave restricted airspace, fire a warning burst. Show it you're serious. Make it clear this isn't a friendly visit anymore. Castillo arms his cannons, those 30mm Soviet-designed instruments of percussive diplomacy that can shred armor plating and reduce aircraft to confetti. He fires a warning burst, deliberately aiming to miss but demonstrate capability. The object's response? Absolutely nothing. Doesn't flinch, doesn't move, doesn't react in any detectable way. It's the aerial equivalent of being ignored at a party, except the stakes are slightly higher and involve military hardware. Ground control, now thoroughly concerned that this thing is either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident, issues the escalation everyone was hoping to avoid: direct engagement. If it won't leave and won't respond to warnings, treat it as hostile. Castillo is authorized to fire on target, so he does. He lines up a proper firing solution, not a warning shot but an actual attack run, and opens up with his cannons directly at the object. Now these aren't pellet guns. These are military-grade weapons, firing rounds designed to penetrate and destroy. In the approximately 64 rounds he fires during the initial burst, every single one should connect given the range and target size. And they do connect. The tracers, ammunition mixed with pyrotechnic compound that glows in flight so pilots can see their trajectory, clearly show rounds hitting the object. Except here's where physics takes a coffee break and sanity files a formal complaint. The object absorbs the impact with zero visible damage. No holes, no dents, no pieces flying off, no explosion, no apparent concern whatsoever. It's like shooting a battleship with a BB gun, except worse because at least the battleship would show some scuff marks. This thing just takes the hits like they're gentle rain and continues hovering exactly where it was, completely unbothered by Castillo's best efforts to ruin its day. And then it moves. Observable number 2 in action. Instantaneous acceleration that makes Castillo's advanced fighter jet look like it's powered by hamsters on a wheel. The object goes from stationary hover to an estimated speed exceeding 10,000 miles per hour, in what witnesses on the ground and Castillo in the air describe as no time at all. Not a gradual acceleration, not a visible thrust signature, just suddenly moving at a speed that shouldn't be possible in atmosphere without creating sonic booms that would shatter windows for miles. Castillo's Su-22, capable of 1,400 miles per hour at maximum performance, might as well be parked. There's no pursuit, no chase, no dramatic dogfight. The object is just gone, and Castillo is left sitting in his cockpit probably questioning every assumption he ever had about aviation and physics. But it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective and comfort level with reality doing unexpected things. The object doesn't just fly away into the distance like any sensible aircraft would after being shot at. It stops. Dead stop. Instantaneous. From over 10,000 miles per hour to zero in the time it takes to blink, demonstrating deceleration that would turn any human pilot into a very thin paste distributed evenly throughout the cockpit. And where does it stop? Right back at the approximate location where it started, hovering over the base perimeter like it just finished a quick errand and returned to its original parking spot. Ground radar confirms this. They watched it accelerate to impossible speeds, travel several miles in seconds, then return to hover with the kind of precision that suggests this isn't random behavior or system malfunction. This is controlled, intentional movement demonstrating capabilities that human technology in 1980 cannot match. Castillo, now thoroughly aware that he's outmatched by something that treats his weapons like annoying insects, makes several more intercept attempts under orders from command, who are probably hoping the first encounter was a fluke or sensor error, despite having 1,800 witnesses watching from the ground. Each attempt follows the same pattern. Castillo approaches, the object remains stationary, he fires, the rounds impact and do absolutely nothing. The object accelerates to impossible speeds, stops instantly somewhere else, then returns to hover. It's like fighting something that's simultaneously indestructible and faster than anything in your arsenal, which is a tactical situation that military academies don't really cover, because it's not supposed to exist outside of science fiction. After approximately 22 minutes of this thoroughly one-sided encounter, command orders Castillo to break off and return to base, probably because continuing to shoot at something that clearly doesn't care about bullets is wasting ammunition and pilot. Dignity. Now let's talk about what's documented here, because this isn't a story passed around at pilot bars after too many drinks. This encounter was witnessed by nearly 1,800 military personnel on the ground, who watched the object hover, watched Castillo's intercept attempts, and saw the impossible acceleration and stopping that followed. Ground radar tracked the entire encounter with data showing speeds and movements that violate known aerodynamic principles. Castillo filed official reports that were reviewed by Peruvian Air Force Command and eventually forwarded to intelligence agencies including the Pentagon, because when your pilot encounters something that demonstrates technology beyond anything in your inventory, you tell the people who need to know about potential threats to airspace sovereignty. This wasn't swept under a rug or classified into oblivion. Peru's approach to transparency meant the encounter became part of official record, analysed by professionals whose job is assessing aerospace capabilities and threat levels. Let's check off the observables demonstrated during this encounter, because it's basically a greatest hits collection of impossible physics. Observable 1, anti-gravity lift, object hovering with no visible propulsion system, confirmed by visual observation and radar tracking. Observable 2, instantaneous acceleration, 0 to over 10,000 miles per hour with no gradual build-up, confirmed by multiple witnesses and radar data. Observable 3, hypersonic velocities without signatures, moving at speeds that should create massive sonic booms and heat signatures, yet doing so quietly enough that only people watching directly noticed. Observable 4, we can infer some level of low observability given the object's ability to apparently appear and operate without prior detection before the formation, though this one's less dramatic than the others. Observable 5. While not demonstrated in this specific encounter, transmedium capability isn't ruled out, and similar objects in the region have shown this characteristic. The psychological impact on Castillo and the ground personnel can't be overstated. You train for years on threat assessment, aerial combat, intercept procedures, and weapon systems effectiveness. You learn what's possible, what's difficult, and what's impossible. Then you encounter something that demonstrates your entire framework of understanding is incomplete at best, and possibly fundamentally wrong at worst. Castillo went up in one of the fastest fighters available in 1980, armed with weapons designed to destroy aerial targets, and accomplished exactly nothing against an object that treated his best efforts like an inconvenient breeze. That's humbling in a way that stays with you, and it's the kind of experience that makes pilots very interested in understanding what they encountered even decades later. The object eventually departed, not because Castillo drove it away or damaged it, because clearly that wasn't happening, but apparently because it finished whatever it was doing and decided to leave. It accelerated vertically at speeds that again should have created visible and audible signatures, and simply vanished from radar and visual tracking. Gone. No gradual climb to altitude, no cruise phase, just instant departure like someone flipped a switch and turned off its presence in this particular piece of airspace. The base returned to normal operations, or as normal as operations can be after nearly 2,000 people collectively witnessed technology that shouldn't exist demonstrating capabilities that violate known physics. This encounter is significant not just because it's well documented and multiply witnessed, but because it demonstrates active engagement with a phenomenon that's often discussed in passive observational terms. This wasn't just, we saw something weird in the sky, this was, we detected an object in restricted airspace, scrambled a fighter, engaged it with weapons, and discovered very conclusively that whatever it is, it's not constrained by the same technological limitations we are. It's a data point that contributes to a larger pattern of encounters suggesting something is operating in our airspace, with capabilities beyond current human technology, and that something is either uninterested in, or unconcerned by our attempts at interception or engagement. The questions raised by this encounter are substantial. What was that object? Where did it come from? Who or what was controlling it? What was it doing, hovering over a military base during formation exercises? Why did it demonstrate its capabilities so overtly, when it could have remained undetected or simply left when approached? Was this observation, reconnaissance, testing of military response capabilities, or something else entirely? The answers remain elusive decades later, but the encounter itself is documented thoroughly enough that dismissal isn't an option unless you're willing to call nearly 2,000 trained military personnel and multiple radar systems unreliable, which seems like a stretch. And this brings us to the next logical question, the one that everyone asks when confronted with an encounter this well documented. Could this have been human technology? Could some nation on Earth in 1980 have built something with these capabilities? It's a fair question, and one that deserves serious examination, because if this was human-made, it represents a technological leap so significant that whoever built it would have aerospace dominance that makes every other nation's military look like kids playing with paper airplanes. So let's examine that possibility carefully, because understanding what human technology could and couldn't do in 1980 is essential for assessing whether Castillo encountered an experimental drone, an advanced prototype, or something that comes from somewhere else entirely. So we could spend hours debating whether Castillo encountered experimental American drones, or Soviet prototypes, or secret technology from nations we haven't even considered, and trust me, we will circle back to that question because it matters. But before we get lost in Cold War speculation and technical capabilities from 1980, let's jump forward nearly 40 years to 2019, same general region, same impossible flight characteristics, and a witness who definitely can't reveal his identity. Because unlike military pilots who have some institutional protection when reporting anomalous encounters, commercial airline captains have exactly zero career safety net when it comes to discussing UFOs. So we'll call him Captain Martinez, not his real name, obviously, because he'd very much like to keep his job, his flight status, and his reputation intact, which are all things you risk when you go public about seeing something that aviation authorities would prefer you didn't see or at least didn't talk about. Martinez has been flying commercial routes for over 15 years, logging thousands of hours in the cockpit of various aircraft, mostly operating flights along South America's Pacific coast. He's the kind of pilot whose experience level means he can identify aircraft types from their navigation lights at distance, distinguish between weather phenomena and actual objects, and generally knows what belongs in the sky and what doesn't. This isn't someone prone to panic or misidentification. This is a professional whose entire career depends on accurate observation and sound judgment under pressure, which makes what happened during a routine evening flight in late 2019 particularly significant, because Martinez saw something that checked multiple boxes on our 5 observables list and matched descriptions from encounters that happened before he was even born. The flight is routine, and I want to emphasize that word because it's important for understanding why what happens next is so jarring. Routine altitude around 37,000 feet, routine passenger load heading from one South American capital to another, routine weather conditions with good visibility, routine everything. The kind of flight where the biggest challenge is staying alert during the cruise phase when autopilot is handling most of the work, and the cockpit settles into that comfortable rhythm that comes from doing the same thing hundreds of times. Martinez and his first officer are monitoring instruments, maintaining communication with air traffic control, and generally experiencing the aviation equivalent of a commute you've done so many times you could navigate it half asleep. Not exactly the setting where you expect your understanding of physics to get thoroughly challenged. But then again, neither was a military formation at La Jolla Air Base back in 1980. The first indication something unusual is happening comes from the first officer who spots movement off their port side, something that appears to be pacing their aircraft at the same altitude and speed. In commercial aviation, this isn't completely unheard of. Sometimes you'll have another aircraft on a parallel route. Sometimes military jets are conducting exercises in the area. Sometimes you'll even get close enough to another commercial flight to exchange waves with their crew if you're bored enough. But this object isn't showing up on their traffic collision avoidance system, which is basically a sophisticated radar system designed to detect other aircraft and prevent mid-air collisions. The TCAS is silent. No alert, no traffic indication, nothing suggesting there's another aircraft within relevant distance. Yet visually, there's definitely something out there, and it's keeping perfect formation with their aircraft in a way that suggests either incredible piloting skill or automated tracking that's locked onto them specifically. Martinez gets visual confirmation, and what he sees makes absolutely zero sense from an aviation perspective. The object appears to be roughly spherical or disc-shaped, difficult to determine exact geometry given the distance and lighting conditions, metallic or reflective surface catching light in ways that make it clearly visible against the darkening sky, and approximately 40 to 50 feet in diameter, based on his estimation relative to known reference points. No visible wings, no tail section, no engine and cells, no navigation lights, no strobes, nothing that identifies it as conventional aircraft. Just this smooth metallic object maintaining perfect formation, with a commercial airliner cruising at 37,000 feet and roughly 500 knots. And here's where it gets interesting. The object maintains this position for approximately 8 minutes, which is a very long time to be pacing an aircraft when you have no apparent propulsion system, and physics says you shouldn't be able to hover. At that altitude anyway. Martinez contacts air traffic control because that's protocol when you've got unidentified traffic in your vicinity. The conversation, which he later recounts in anonymous interviews with researchers, goes about as well as you'd expect. A TC checks their radar. They're tracking Martinez's aircraft exactly as expected. They're tracking other commercial traffic in the region. They're not tracking anything in the location where Martinez reports visual contact with an object, which creates an uncomfortable situation where you've got two experienced pilots in a modern airliner with functioning instruments reporting visual contact with something that radar says isn't there, or at least isn't appearing on radar in the way normal aircraft appear. This is observable number 4 in action. Low observability or cloaking that allows the object to be visually present while minimizing or eliminating its radar signature. Commercial radar should absolutely detect a 40-foot metallic object at that range and altitude, yet it's not showing up, which suggests either the object has radar absorbing or radar deflecting properties, or it's operating with some kind of stealth. Technology that makes military stealth aircraft look primitive by comparison. The object then demonstrates why Martinez is choosing anonymity over recognition. After maintaining formation for 8 minutes, long enough that both pilots have thoroughly confirmed they're seeing the same thing, and it's not an optical illusion, or tired eyes playing tricks, the object accelerates. And when I say accelerates, I mean it goes from cruising speed matching the airliner to what Martinez estimates is several thousand miles per hour in under 2 seconds. Observable number 2, instantaneous acceleration that generates g-forces that would liquefy any biological pilot and requires propulsion systems we don't possess. No gradual speed increase, no visible thrust, no exhaust signature, just suddenly moving at velocities that shouldn't be possible in atmosphere without creating sonic booms that would rattle windows on the ground below. Yet the acceleration is silent from Martinez's perspective. No boom, no shockwave affecting his aircraft, nothing but the visual observation of something moving impossibly fast. Here's where the story gets really uncomfortable for people who prefer their reality to follow predictable rules. The object doesn't just accelerate away into the distance, it stops. Dead stop. From several thousand miles per hour to zero velocity in what appears to be instantaneous deceleration, demonstrating the same physics-defying characteristics Castillo witnessed in 1980. The object holds this new position for roughly 30 seconds, still visible to Martinez and his first officer, still not appearing on any radar, still exhibiting observable number 1 with anti-gravity lift because it's hovering at altitude with no visible means of support. And then it repeats the performance, instantaneous acceleration to extreme speed, covering distance that should take minutes in seconds, followed by instantaneous stop at a new location. It's like watching someone demonstrate that inertia is optional and acceleration forces are more of a suggestion than a law, which would be fascinating if it wasn't so thoroughly disturbing. The entire encounter lasts approximately 12 minutes from initial sighting to final departure, and it ends the way these encounters typically end. The object accelerates vertically at speed that again should create visible and audible signatures, but apparently doesn't, and disappears from view climbing towards space, or at least to altitudes where visual tracking becomes impossible. Martinez and his first officer are left in the cockpit of their aircraft, instruments all showing normal operation, aircraft performing exactly as expected, but with the shared knowledge that they just witnessed something that they're training. Experience and understanding of aviation says shouldn't exist. And unlike military pilots who might have institutional channels for reporting anomalous encounters, commercial pilots face a very different reality when it comes to discussing UFOs. Martinez files an internal report with his airline because that's protocol when you observe anything unusual during flight operations. The response is about what you'd expect from an industry that values predictability and really doesn't want conversations about unexplained aerial phenomena affecting passenger confidence. The report is noted, filed, and from Martinez's perspective, appears to vanish into administrative bureaucracy with no follow-up, no investigation, and definitely no acknowledgement that something significant happened. He's not reprimanded, that would require acknowledging the report exists, but there's an unspoken understanding that pursuing this further would be career-limiting in ways that don't require explicit threats. Just the knowledge that pilots who talk too much about seeing weird things tend to find themselves under enhanced medical scrutiny, psychological evaluation, and the kind of administrative attention that makes your life very difficult very quickly. So why does this 2019 encounter matter beyond being another entry in the long list of unexplained aerial sightings? Because it demonstrates pattern repetition across 40 years in the same geographic region. Castillo, in 1980, encountered a metallic sphere exhibiting impossible flight characteristics, demonstrating multiple observables, and showing apparent awareness of military response. Martinez, in 2019, encounters a metallic sphere exhibiting the same impossible flight characteristics, demonstrating the same observables in the same general region of South American airspace. The technology, if that's what it is, hasn't changed or degraded over 4 decades. The behavior patterns are consistent. The observables remain identical. This isn't random sightings of different phenomena that happen to get lumped together under the UFO label. This is the same type of object doing the same types of things in the same geographic area, separated by 40 years of human technological advancement that apparently hasn't brought us any closer to replicating what these objects can do. And Martinez isn't alone. Since 2019, researchers collecting anonymous reports from commercial aviation personnel have documented dozens of similar encounters along South American flight routes. Pilots who can't come forward publicly because their careers depend on maintaining industry standards that don't include seize UFOs as an acceptable characteristic. First officers who corroborate their captain's sightings but stay silent because speaking up would tag them as unreliable, regardless of their flight hours or safety record. Flight attendants who sometimes witness these encounters from passenger cabin windows, but know that reporting would mark them as problematic employees. The result is a massive underreporting problem where the people who spend the most time in commercial airspace, pilots logging hundreds of hours monthly at altitudes where these objects operate, are incentivized to stay silent rather than contribute to our understanding of what's actually happening up there. Think about that for a moment. We've got professional pilots, people trusted with hundreds of lives per flight, people whose training emphasizes accurate observation and immediate reporting of anything unusual, and they're staying silent about encounters with objects that demonstrate technology beyond anything in our aerospace inventory. Not because the encounters aren't happening. Multiple anonymous surveys suggest commercial pilots see unexplained phenomena far more frequently than public reports indicate, but because the professional and personal costs of reporting outweigh any benefit. Your career advancement depends on being seen as stable, reliable, and conventional. Reporting UFO encounters, even well-documented ones with multiple witnesses and corroborating data, marks you as none of those things in an industry that values conformity and predictability above almost everything else. This creates a data collection nightmare for anyone trying to understand the scope and frequency of these encounters. Military pilots have some institutional protection. Their reports go through classified channels, get analysed by intelligence personnel whose job includes assessing aerospace threats, and while they might face stigma, they're at least operating within a framework that acknowledges unusual encounters need documentation and analysis. Commercial pilots have none of that. Their reports go to airlines whose primary concern is passenger confidence and operational continuity, not scientific understanding of unexplained phenomena. Airlines don't want conversations about UFOs because passengers don't want to think about unexplained objects operating in the same airspace as their vacation flights to Cancun. The economic incentive is towards silence and denial, not investigation and transparency. Martinez's encounter demonstrates why this silence is problematic beyond just scientific curiosity. He's flying a commercial aircraft with passengers aboard, and an object of unknown origin approaches to within what he estimates is less than 500 yards, maintains formation for 8 minutes, then demonstrates flight capabilities that suggest technology far beyond anything we understand. That's a potential air safety issue regardless of what the object is or where it's from. If these objects are operating with apparent intelligence and purpose in commercial flight corridors, that creates collision risk, wake turbulence concerns, and the general problem of sharing airspace with traffic that doesn't follow conventional flight rules or respond to air traffic control. Yet the response from aviation authorities is essentially to pretend it's not happening, because acknowledging it would require addressing questions nobody wants to answer. The pattern repetition from 1980 to 2019 suggests several possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. First possibility: these objects are conducting long-term observation or surveillance of human activity, specifically aviation operations, and they've been doing so consistently for at least 40 years. The fact that they're still appearing in the same regions with the same characteristics suggests whatever information they're gathering hasn't satisfied their requirements yet, or they're conducting continuous monitoring rather than one-time reconnaissance. Second possibility: these objects are using South American airspace as transit routes or operational areas, and encounters with human aircraft are incidental rather than intentional. We happen to be flying through space they're using, and occasionally our paths cross in ways that result in visual sightings or radar contacts. Third possibility: the objects are actively testing or demonstrating capabilities to human observers, showing us what they can do in controlled encounters that don't escalate to actual conflict, but make very clear that we're outmatched technologically. None of these possibilities is reassuring if you're hoping for simple explanations that don't require reconsidering our assumptions about what's possible in aerospace technology, or who else might be operating in Earth's atmosphere and orbital space. But the pattern is there, documented across decades, witnessed by trained observers using professional equipment, and demonstrating characteristics that remain consistent regardless of when or where the encounters occur. Martinez in 2019 saw essentially the same thing Castillo saw in 1980, which suggests either remarkable consistency in whatever technology is being employed, or these encounters involve the same objects or same type of objects operating continuously. Over multi-decade periods without apparent degradation or technological evolution we can detect. And here's the really troubling question. If these encounters are happening with enough frequency that commercial pilots are seeing them regularly, but staying silent, and military pilots are documenting them through classified channels we only occasionally glimpse through leaks and whistleblowers, how many encounters are occurring that never get reported at all? How many private pilots see something unusual but figure nobody would believe them anyway? How many passengers glance out aircraft windows during flights and witness objects pacing their plane but assume it's another aircraft, or don't recognize what they're seeing? The visible reports might represent only a fraction of actual encounters, with the real numbers hidden under layers of institutional silence, personal reluctance to face ridicule, and systematic underreporting driven by career preservation instincts. Martinez's story matters because it puts a human face on the ongoing nature of this phenomenon. This isn't ancient history, this is last few years, and it's happening to pilots flying routes you might book for your next vacation. The person responsible for safely transporting you and your family from point A to point B might have encountered technology that defies known physics during their last work week, and they're not talking about it because talking about it would end their career. That silence protects individual pilots but leaves passengers and the general public completely unaware that these encounters are happening with disturbing regularity in airspace we assume is well monitored and well understood. The 2019 encounter also raises the same question Castillo's 1980 encounter raised. What are these objects, and where do they come from? Have we developed technology in the 40 years between these encounters that could explain what Martinez saw? Do any nations on Earth possess the capability to build objects that demonstrate all 5 observables simultaneously? Or are we looking at something that originates outside current human technological capability, which opens substantially more complicated questions about who or what is operating in our airspace and why? These questions lead naturally to examination of human aerospace capabilities, both public and classified, to determine whether anything we've built could match the performance characteristics witnessed in these encounters. And that examination gets uncomfortable very quickly, because the answer appears to be no. Now let's shift our attention from South American airspace to one of the most remote, inhospitable, and frankly bizarre regions on the planet when it comes to unexplained aerial activity, Alaska. If South America is the UFO hotspot nobody talks about, Alaska is the UFO hotspot where encounters happen in locations so isolated that witnesses could scream about what they saw and nobody would hear them except maybe a confused moose. We're talking about a region where human population density is measured in square miles per person rather than people per square mile, where weather conditions can shift from manageable to life-threatening in minutes, and where the landscape is so vast and rugged that entire mountain ranges exist with no human presence whatsoever. It's also, conveniently or inconveniently depending on your perspective, a major corridor for international air traffic between North America and Asia, home to numerous military installations due to its strategic location during the Cold War, and apparently a favourite operating area for objects that enjoy demonstrating impossible physics to witnesses who really just wanted to fix a navigation beacon and go home. The encounter we're focusing on happened in October 1999, which is recent enough that the technology and equipment involved are well documented, but old enough that the witnesses have had 2 decades to process what they saw and decide whether coming forward is worth the inevitable skepticism and ridicule. The location is near Cold Bay, Alaska, a community of roughly 100 people on the Alaska Peninsula that exist primarily to support the airport and military installations in the area. Cold Bay sits at the intersection of nowhere and nothing, surrounded by volcanic peaks, the Bering Sea, and enough wilderness to make you reconsider every life choice that led you to working in a place where the nearest Starbucks is approximately 600 miles away and grizzly bears outnumber humans by ratios that don't inspire confidence. It's also directly beneath major commercial flight routes, which becomes relevant when we discuss why these objects might be operating in this specific region with such apparent frequency. Our witnesses are civilian contractors, specifically maintenance technicians working for a navigation services company that maintains the network of beacons and guidance systems essential for aviation safety in remote regions. These aren't government employees with clearance levels and non-disclosure agreements preventing them from discussing what they see. These are regular working people whose job involves climbing mountains in terrible weather to fix equipment that keeps aircraft from crashing into said mountains, which is both essential work and the kind of job description that makes you wonder about their decision-making process. The 3-person team for this particular maintenance run consists of David Chen, lead technician with 12 years' experience maintaining navigation equipment across Alaska, Rebecca Torres, electronics specialist who handles the technical diagnostics, and repairs, and Mike Sullivan, support technician responsible for equipment transport and site safety. Normal people doing normal work in abnormal locations, about to have an encounter that will make them very carefully consider what constitutes normal reality. The maintenance target is a navigation beacon positioned at approximately 3,200 feet elevation on the lower slopes of Mount Shishaldin, an active volcano that rises to over 9,300 feet and has the distinction of being one of the most symmetrical, volcanic cones on Earth, which sounds like a tourist brochure description until you're actually there in October, with wind chill making the temperature feel substantially colder than the already frigid air temperature. The beacon is essential for aircraft navigation through the region, providing guidance signals that help pilots maintain proper flight paths through airspace, where terrain, weather, and limited visibility create significant hazards. When beacons malfunction or require routine maintenance, contractors like Chen's team get deployed regardless of weather conditions or personal preference, because aviation safety doesn't pause for comfort or convenience. The team arrives at the site via helicopter transport, the only practical way to access these remote installations, and begins routine diagnostic work on the beacon systems. The weather is typical for October in this region, meaning cold, windy, and generally unpleasant, but not immediately life-threatening, which counts as good conditions when you're working on a volcanic slope in Alaska. Visibility is decent, cloud cover is intermittent, and they've got several hours of daylight remaining to complete the maintenance and get extracted before conditions potentially deteriorate. Everything is proceeding normally, which in retrospect is always when the universe decides normal is overrated, and it's time to introduce some chaos into your well-planned workday. Torres is running diagnostics on the beacon's electronic systems, Chen is inspecting the physical mounting structure for weather damage and stability, and Sullivan is managing their equipment and maintaining communication with the helicopter pilot, who's waiting at a lower elevation for the completion signal. It's roughly 2:30 in the afternoon when Sullivan, who's facing northwest toward the Bering Sea and the neighbouring volcanic peaks, spots something that makes him stop mid-sentence during a radio check with the pilot. He calls out to Chen and Torres, pointing toward Mount Shishaldin's summit area, where something metallic is reflecting afternoon sunlight in a way that immediately registers as wrong for this environment. No aircraft should be that close to an active volcano. No helicopter operates at that altitude in these conditions. No drone technology in 1999 has the range or capability to reach that elevation and maintain stable flight in the wind conditions they're experiencing at 3,200 feet, which are substantially worse at 9,000 plus feet. All three technicians now have visual contact with an object that appears to be hovering or moving very slowly near the volcano's summit. Distance estimation is difficult in this terrain. Mountains distort perception of scale and distance in ways that consistently fool even experienced outdoors people. But based on the known dimensions of Mount Shishaldin and surrounding geographic features, they estimate the object is roughly 40 to 60 feet in diameter. The shape appears disc-like or lens-shaped, metallic surface that's definitely reflecting light rather than generating it, and exhibiting the kind of smooth, seamless construction that doesn't match any aircraft they're familiar with. No visible propulsion system, no exhaust, no rotors, no wings, just this metallic disc hanging in the air near a volcanic summit like gravity sent a strongly worded letter suggesting it take the day off. Chen grabs the team's camera, standard equipment for documenting site conditions and equipment status during maintenance operations, and starts filming. Unfortunately for everyone hoping for crystal clear 4K footage, this is 1999, and they're using a consumer-grade video camera that was considered decent quality at the time, but produces footage that by modern standards looks like it was filmed through a shower curtain during an earthquake. The resulting video shows something definitely present and definitely anomalous, but lacks the resolution and stability to satisfy skeptics who demand proof that meets standards no field equipment from that era could provide. Still, it's documentation, and combined with 3 independent witness accounts from trained technicians whose jobs require accurate observation, it contributes to the evidentiary record even if it doesn't provide the smoking gun clarity everyone wishes existed. The object maintains its position near the summit for approximately 4 minutes, long enough for all 3 witnesses to observe it carefully, discuss what they're seeing to confirm they're all witnessing the same phenomenon, and capture several minutes of video footage. Then it moves, and this is where we get our observables demonstration that makes Alaska's encounter every bit as significant as the South American cases, despite involving civilian contractors rather than military pilots. The object, which had been either hovering or moving very slowly near the summit, suddenly accelerates horizontally at speed that Chen later describes as impossibly fast, like watching something teleport rather than move. Observable number 2 in A. Full effect. Instantaneous acceleration from essentially stationary to what they estimate is several thousand miles per hour based on the distance covered and time elapsed. But here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply unsettling for anyone hoping these encounters can be explained through conventional aerospace technology. The object doesn't just accelerate away into the distance. It stops, completely, instantly, from several thousand miles per hour to zero velocity with no deceleration period, no gradual slowdown, just immediate transition from extreme speed to stationary position. And where does it stop? Directly above their position at the navigation beacon, hovering at what they estimate is 200 to 300 feet altitude. Close enough that they can see detail. The metallic surface appears seamless with no visible panel lines or access hatches. The underside shows no propulsion systems or exhaust ports, and the entire object appears to be rotating slowly on its vertical axis, though whether this rotation serves functional purpose or is incidental to its operation remains unclear. The psychological impact of having something demonstrating impossible flight characteristics suddenly appear directly overhead cannot be overstated. These are people who work in remote locations, who are comfortable with isolation and unexpected situations, who deal with equipment failures and weather emergencies as routine parts of their job. But having a 40 to 60 foot metallic disc hovering overhead, after demonstrating acceleration and deceleration that violates known physics, creates the kind of existential discomfort that stays with you. Chen later describes the feeling as like being watched by something that wants you to know you're being watched, which is substantially more unsettling than oblivious observation would be. The object maintains this overhead position for roughly 90 seconds, during which time all three contractors are filming, watching, and probably reconsidering their life choices that led them to a volcanic slope in Alaska. Then comes the finale that cements this encounter in the definitely not conventional technology category. The object, still hovering overhead, suddenly accelerates vertically upward. Not at the gradual climb rate you'd expect from a helicopter, or the steep but measured ascent of a high-performance aircraft. Vertical acceleration that Chen describes as like a bullet being fired straight up, reaching speeds they estimate in the thousands of miles per hour based on how quickly it disappears from view. The object shoots directly up Mount Shishaldin slope over the summit and continues climbing until it's no longer visible. No sonic boom despite the speeds involved. Observable number 3 demonstrating hypersonic velocities without acoustic signatures. No visible exhaust or propulsion despite the acceleration forces that should require massive energy output. Just smooth, silent, impossibly fast vertical departure that leaves 3 contractors standing on a volcanic slope, questioning everything they thought they understood about what's possible in aerospace technology. The entire encounter from initial sighting to final departure spans roughly 7 minutes. 7 minutes that provided multiple demonstrations of the observables we've discussed. Anti-gravity lift with the object hovering near the volcano summit, and directly overhead with no visible propulsion, instantaneous acceleration from stationary to extreme speeds, hypersonic velocities without creating sonic booms or visible exhaust signatures, and if we're being generous, potential low observability given that the object appeared suddenly without any prior detection, despite clear visibility. Conditions. The only observable not demonstrated is transmedium travel, though given Alaska's proximity to the Bering Sea and Pacific Ocean, similar objects in this region have been reported entering and exiting water, so it's not unreasonable to suspect this. Capability exists even if it wasn't demonstrated during this particular encounter. Now here's where the story takes a turn that's simultaneously predictable and frustrating. Chen, Torres and Sullivan return from their maintenance run with video footage, witness testimony, and a story that should prompt serious investigation from aviation authorities, military intelligence, or anyone concerned with understanding what's operating in Alaskan airspace. Instead, they encounter exactly the response that keeps most witnesses silent. Their employer, upon hearing about the encounter, strongly suggests that discussing it publicly would be problematic for their continued employment. Not an explicit threat, that would create legal complications, just a clear understanding that bringing attention to the company through UFO reports would be viewed unfavorably and might affect future contract assignments. The message is clear. You saw what you saw, we're not calling you liars, but talking about it publicly is career-limiting behavior that we strongly discourage. The 3 contractors, needing their jobs and aware that coming forward would likely result in mockery rather than serious investigation, agree among themselves to stay silent. They keep copies of the footage, they maintain their own records of the encounter, but they don't go public, don't contact media, don't reach out to UFO research organizations. They become part of the invisible majority of witnesses who see something significant, but choose silence over the personal and professional costs of speaking out. It's only years later, after retirement or career changes that make employer retaliation less concerning, that witnesses like Chen begin sharing their stories with researchers who've built trust through years of careful investigation and protection of witness identities. So why Alaska? And why does this region see so much unexplained aerial activity despite being one of the least populated areas in North America? Several factors make Alaska uniquely interesting from both human and potentially non-human perspectives. First, it's a major international air corridor. The Great Circle routes between North America and Asia pass directly over Alaska, meaning thousands of commercial flights transit this airspace annually. If you're interested in observing human aviation operations and technology, Alaska provides opportunities to watch aircraft from dozens of nations operating at various altitudes and flight profiles. Second, Alaska hosts significant military presence due to its strategic location. Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Eielson Air Force Base, Fort Wainwright, and numerous other installations mean substantial military aviation activity, including fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, and surveillance platforms. Again, if you're conducting reconnaissance or technology assessment, this concentration of military aviation provides valuable observation opportunities. Third, Alaska's geographic features are unique. Active volcanoes, extensive coastline, deep ocean trenches, mountain ranges, and vast uninhabited wilderness create an environment where operations could be conducted with minimal risk of close-range human observation. The object Chen's team witnessed could have been operating in that region for hours or days before encountering human witnesses, and could continue operations after their departure, with a low probability of additional encounters. Fourth, Alaska's position relative to Earth's magnetic field and auroral zone creates unusual atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions that some researchers speculate might be relevant to exotic propulsion systems that interact with planetary magnetic fields. It's theoretical, but the correlation between UFO sightings and regions with unusual geomagnetic characteristics is strong enough to warrant consideration. The connection to commercial flight paths is particularly concerning from an aviation safety perspective. Objects demonstrating the speed, maneuverability, and apparent disregard for collision avoidance protocols that characterize these encounters present obvious hazards to commercial aviation operating in the same airspace. A 737 cruising at 35,000 feet traveling at 500 knots has limited ability to maneuver if an object suddenly appears in its flight path demonstrating the kind of instantaneous acceleration Chen's team witnessed. The closing speeds involved would give pilots essentially zero reaction time, and the possibility of collision, whether accidental or through object misjudgment of human aircraft limitations, represents an ongoing risk that aviation authorities appear reluctant to acknowledge publicly despite almost certainly being aware of it through classified reporting channels. The Alaska encounters, combined with the South American cases we've discussed, reveal a global pattern of activity that's been ongoing for decades at minimum. Objects demonstrating the same flight characteristics appear in regions separated by thousands of miles, witnessed by different people with different backgrounds and no opportunity for coordination or story contamination. The observables remain consistent: anti-gravity lift, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without signatures, low observability, and transmedium travel show up repeatedly across independent witness accounts from military pilots. Commercial aviators and civilian contractors who happen to be in the right place at the right time to witness something extraordinary. Chen, Torres, and Sullivan's encounter matters because it demonstrates these phenomena aren't limited to military contexts or restricted airspace. They're happening in civilian work environments, witnessed by people with no security clearances, no military training, no predetermined expectations about UFOs, and no institutional framework for processing the experience. Just normal people doing normal jobs who witnessed technology that shouldn't exist, and had to navigate the aftermath without support, investigation, or acknowledgement from authorities who should be intensely interested in understanding what's operating in airspace they're responsible for monitoring and protecting. And their silence, maintained for years out of professional necessity and personal self-preservation, represents just one data point in a much larger pattern of underreporting that keeps the full scope of this phenomenon hidden from public awareness. So we've established that these encounters are happening with disturbing frequency across multiple continents, witnessed by military pilots, commercial aviators, and civilian contractors who all describe the same impossible flight characteristics. We've got documentation, radar data, multiple independent witnesses, and patterns suggesting coordinated intelligence rather than random phenomenon. Naturally, the next question is, why aren't more people talking about this? Why does it feel like these encounters are rare anomalies when the evidence suggests they're happening regularly enough to constitute a pattern? Welcome to the Silence Code, the unwritten but thoroughly enforced set of rules that keeps aviation professionals from discussing the most significant thing many of them will ever witness during their careers. And trust me, once you understand the pressure that keeps witnesses quiet, the fact that anyone reports these encounters at all becomes the surprising part of the story. Let's start with the most fundamental truth about aviation culture. It rewards predictability, reliability, and conformity. Pilots who follow procedures, maintain professional demeanor, and don't create problems or attract unwanted attention advance in their careers. Pilots who make waves, report unusual incidents that can't be easily explained, or generally become known for seeing things that make administrators uncomfortable, tend to find their career trajectories flattening in ways that are never officially connected to their reporting, but are absolutely connected to their reporting. It's not a conspiracy requiring secret meetings and coordinated suppression. It's just institutional culture optimizing for what's comfortable and convenient rather than what's accurate and honest. And the result is a massive blind spot in our understanding of what's actually happening in global airspace, because the people who spend the most time up there are incentivized to stay silent rather than contribute data. Commercial aviation is particularly brutal in this regard. Your career as a commercial pilot depends on maintaining a Class 1 medical certificate, which requires regular examinations including psychological evaluation components. Now, these evaluations aren't deep Freudian therapy sessions. They're relatively basic assessments designed to screen for conditions that would impair judgment or performance. But here's the catch. Reporting UFO encounters can trigger enhanced psychological scrutiny based on concerns about your mental stability and grip on reality. Not because anyone explicitly accuses you of being mentally ill, but because the administrative machinery treats reports of unexplained phenomena as potential red flags warranting closer examination. And that closer examination means more frequent evaluations, more invasive questioning, and the kind of paperwork trail that follows you through your career, like a particularly persistent ex who won't take the hint. The process works like this. You're a commercial captain with 15 years experience, thousands of flight hours, perfect safety record, respected by colleagues and trusted by employers. You have an encounter with something that exhibits flight characteristics you know are impossible with current technology. You're trained to report anomalous observations because aviation safety depends on accurate reporting of anything unusual. So you file a report through official channels, describing what you saw in objective terms, noting that your first officer corroborates the sighting, mentioning that the object appeared on instruments before vanishing. Seems reasonable, right? You witnessed something unusual, you documented it, you followed proper reporting procedures. Unfortunately, what happens next is absolutely not reasonable, and is precisely why most pilots choose silence over honesty. First, your report gets flagged for review. Not because it's being taken seriously as potential evidence of unexplained aerial phenomena, but because it's being evaluated as potential evidence that you're experiencing perceptual issues, judgment problems, or psychological conditions that might affect your fitness to fly. The assumption isn't this pilot witnessed something we should investigate. The assumption is this pilot reported something unusual, which might indicate problems we need to assess. Already we're off to a terrible start from a truth-seeking perspective, but it gets worse. Second, you're called in for additional medical evaluation. The aviation medical examiner asks careful questions designed to assess your mental state, your stress levels, your sleep patterns, your medication use, your personal life stability. They're looking for explanations that fit comfortable narratives. You were tired, you were stressed, you misidentified something conventional, you were influenced by recent media coverage of UFOs. The possibility that you accurately observed something genuinely anomalous isn't on their diagnostic flowchart because that possibility creates administrative headaches nobody wants to deal with. Third, regardless of what the evaluation concludes, you now have a file notation indicating you reported unusual aerial observations that required follow-up assessment. This notation doesn't say pilot is mentally ill or pilot is unreliable. It doesn't have to. It just exists as a data point that subtly affects how your future reports are received, how your medical renewals are processed, and how administrators perceive your overall reliability. You've become that pilot who reported a UFO, and in aviation culture where conformity and predictability are prized above almost everything else, that's not a label that helps your career advancement. You might not get grounded, you might not lose your job, but you've definitely created a problem for yourself that wouldn't exist if you just stayed quiet and pretended you didn't see anything unusual. And here's the really insidious part. This process isn't designed to suppress UFO reports specifically. It's just the natural consequence of an administrative system that treats any unusual report as a potential indicator of pilot problems, rather than a potential indicator of genuine phenomenon requiring investigation. The system isn't conspiring against truth. It's just optimized for different priorities, primarily maintaining public confidence in aviation safety and minimizing disruptive questions that don't have comfortable answers. UFO reports are disruptive. They raise questions administrators can't answer, and they potentially undermine public confidence if people start thinking unexplained objects are operating in the same airspace as their vacation flights. So the system responds by scrutinizing the reporter rather than investigating the report, which creates exactly the incentive structure you'd design if your goal was minimizing reporting rather than maximizing accurate data collection. Military aviation has similar problems, despite theoretically having better institutional frameworks for handling anomalous observations. Military pilots who report UFO encounters face different but equally significant pressures. Their reports go through classified channels, which sounds better than commercial aviation's approach until you realize that classification often means the report disappears into bureaucratic black holes where it's neither investigated nor acknowledged. The pilot files a report, maybe gets debriefed by intelligence personnel who ask questions but provide no feedback about what they're doing with the information, and then nothing. No follow-up, no investigation results, no indication that the report contributed to any useful understanding of what's happening. Just silence, and the implicit message that this topic isn't something command wants discussed openly. Military pilots also face peer pressure that commercial pilots don't experience to the same degree. Fighter squadrons and aviation units develop tight-knit cultures where reputation among fellow pilots matters enormously. Being known as someone who sees UFOs can damage that reputation in ways that affect everything from mission assignments to promotion opportunities to simple social dynamics within the unit. Nobody wants to be the squadron's resident UFO enthusiast, the person whose observations get met with eye rolls and jokes about little green men. So pilots stay quiet. They don't discuss encounters even with colleagues who might have witnessed similar phenomena, and the result is fragmented understanding where multiple pilots might experience the same things, but never realize they're part of a larger pattern because nobody's talking. The cultural enforcement of silence is remarkably effective despite being largely informal and uncoordinated. It works through mechanisms like career concerns, social pressure, fear of ridicule, and legitimate worry about mental health evaluations. But it also works through something more subtle, the complete lack of institutional support or validation for witnesses who do come forward. When you report a UFO encounter, you're not met with gratitude for contributing valuable observational data. You're not thanked for being willing to document something unusual despite knowing it might create problems for you. You're certainly not celebrated as someone whose honesty and accurate reporting contributed to scientific understanding. Instead, you're met with skepticism, scrutiny, and the clear sense that you've created an administrative inconvenience that everyone wishes you'd just kept to yourself. This creates a calculation every witness has to make. Is reporting what I saw worth the personal and professional costs? For most pilots, the answer is no. The potential benefits may be contributing to some nebulous scientific understanding, maybe helping researchers establish patterns, maybe satisfying a sense of duty to report accurately, don't outweigh the concrete costs of enhanced medical scrutiny, damaged reputation, career complications, and social stigma. So they stay silent. They log the encounter in their personal journals, they maybe discuss it with their spouse or closest friends, but they don't file official reports and they definitely don't go public. And each individual decision to stay quiet is completely rational from a self-preservation perspective, while being collectively catastrophic for our understanding of what's actually happening in our airspace. The numbers on this are genuinely disturbing once you start looking at systematic surveys. Anonymous surveys of commercial pilots, surveys where respondents are assured their identities won't be revealed and their answers won't affect their careers, consistently show that between 10 to 15% of commercial pilots report having witnessed aerial phenomena they couldn't explain using conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. That's thousands of professional aviators globally who've seen something anomalous, but the vast majority never file official reports. Some surveys suggest that for every one reported UFO encounter involving commercial aviation, there are 10 to 20 unreported encounters where the pilot simply chose silence over the hassle and risk of reporting. If those numbers are even approximately accurate, we're missing massive amounts of data about what's operating in commercial airspace, and we're missing it specifically because the reporting infrastructure punishes honesty rather than rewarding it. Military surveys show similar patterns with potentially higher percentages, given that military pilots operate in environments and at performance levels where encounters with high-performance anomalous objects are more likely. Fighter pilots, surveillance aircraft crews, helicopter pilots operating in remote areas all report seeing things that don't match any known aircraft or natural phenomenon, and all face the same calculation about whether reporting is worth the personal cost. The classified nature of military reporting means we have less visibility into actual numbers, but the patterns that emerge from declassified documents and whistleblower testimony suggest underreporting is at least as severe in military aviation as in commercial aviation, possibly worse given the additional layers of classification and compartmentalization that make it easier for reports to disappear without acknowledgement or action. And let's talk about what we're losing through this systematic underreporting. Every unreported encounter is a potential data point that could help establish patterns in object behavior, operational characteristics, geographic concentrations, or temporal trends. Researchers trying to understand this phenomenon are working with incomplete datasets that capture maybe 5 to 10% of actual encounters if the survey numbers are accurate. Imagine trying to understand weather patterns if meteorologists only reported 10% of storms, or trying to track disease outbreaks if doctors only reported 10% of cases. You'd have fragmentary data that might suggest patterns, but couldn't establish them conclusively, because the sample is so incomplete and potentially biased toward unusual cases, rather than representative of the full phenomenon. That's exactly the situation we're in with UFO reporting. We're trying to understand a global phenomenon using data that represents a small, possibly unrepresentative fraction of what's actually occurring. The silence code is enforced not through explicit threats or coordinated suppression, but through cultural norms, institutional incentives, and personal calculations that individually make sense, but collectively create information darkness. Airlines want pilots who don't create problems or publicity complications. Aviation medical authorities want straightforward cases that fit established diagnostic categories. Military commands want pilots who stay focused on mission requirements rather than discussing encounters that raise questions nobody can answer. Pilots want careers that advance smoothly without the complications that come from being known as someone who reports unusual phenomena. Everyone's optimizing for their own legitimate interests, and the combined effect is systematic underreporting of potentially the most significant ongoing phenomenon in modern aviation. And here's what makes this particularly frustrating. The technology exists to collect comprehensive data if anyone actually wanted to. Modern aircraft are equipped with sensors, cameras, radar systems, and data recorders that continuously monitor aircraft systems and surrounding airspace. If aviation authorities mandated reporting of all anomalous observations in equipped aircraft with systems specifically designed to document unusual encounters, we could be collecting high-quality data on every incident. We could have video, radar tracks, electromagnetic signatures, precise timestamps, and geographic coordinates for thousands of encounters annually. Instead, we have incomplete datasets from the small percentage of pilots willing to risk career consequences to report what they've seen, combined with occasional grainy cell phone footage and eyewitness testimony that skeptics can easily dismiss, because it lacks the technical documentation that would make it incontrovertible. The question isn't whether we could be doing better at understanding this phenomenon. Obviously we could be. The question is why we're not, and the answer comes back to institutional priorities and cultural norms that value comfort over truth. It's more comfortable to pretend these encounters aren't happening regularly, than to acknowledge them and confront the implications. It's more convenient to scrutinize individual witnesses than to investigate systematic patterns. It's easier to maintain existing frameworks of understanding than to adapt them based on observations that don't fit comfortable categories. So the silence code persists, the underreporting continues, and we remain collectively ignorant about something that's happening regularly in airspace we assume we understand and control. And this brings us naturally to the next uncomfortable question. What happens when these encounters aren't just strange observations from a distance, but actual close approaches that put aircraft and passengers at risk? Because if objects demonstrating impossible flight characteristics are operating in commercial airspace, and if they're occasionally coming close enough to aircraft that collision becomes a realistic possibility, then this isn't just a scientific curiosity or a question for researchers and enthusiasts. This is an aviation safety crisis that's being systematically ignored because acknowledging it would require confronting questions about what's in our airspace and why we can't control or prevent encounters with it. Let's set aside the fascinating questions about what these objects are, where they come from, and what their presence means for our understanding of reality. Those are important questions, absolutely, but right now we need to talk about something more immediate and frankly more terrifying. These objects are getting dangerously close to passenger aircraft, carrying hundreds of people who have absolutely no idea they came within seconds of potential catastrophe. We're not talking about distant sightings where pilots spot something weird on the horizon and file a report for researchers to analyse later. We're talking about near misses, objects passing within 50 feet of commercial aircraft travelling at 550 knots at 35,000 feet, which in aviation terms is essentially a collision avoided only by luck or last-second manoeuvring. And before you assume these are isolated incidents that get blown out of proportion, understand that multiple commercial pilots have reported these close encounters. The pattern suggests they're happening far more frequently than public records indicate, and we're looking at a potential air safety crisis that aviation authorities are choosing to ignore because acknowledging it would require answering questions they can't answer. Let's talk about what 50 feet of separation means at altitude and speed. Commercial aircraft cruise at approximately 450 to 550 knots, depending on aircraft type and flight conditions. That's roughly 500 to 630 miles per hour for those of us who don't think in nautical miles. At that speed, you're covering about 900 feet per second. An object appearing 50 feet from your aircraft gives you approximately 1/20th of a second to react before potential collision. 1/20th of a second. That's less time than it takes to process what you're seeing, let alone execute any kind of evasive maneuver. And commercial aircraft aren't fighter jets. They can't perform aggressive maneuvers without subjecting passengers to G-forces that would cause injuries. They need substantial distance to change altitude or heading, and their size and inertia mean quick reactions aren't really an option. So when something appears suddenly within 50 feet of a passenger aircraft, you're essentially at the mercy of whether that object decides to maintain its current trajectory or adjust course to avoid collision. Now let's add some scale to this discussion because the numbers are genuinely staggering. On any given day, there are approximately 100,000 commercial flights operating globally. That's 100,000 aircraft carrying millions of passengers through airspace at various altitudes, speeds, and routes. If even a tiny percentage of those flights encounter close approaches by unexplained objects, we're talking about dozens to potentially hundreds of near-miss incidents daily that could result in catastrophic collisions if timing or positioning is slightly different. And remember, we know from pilot surveys that official reports represent maybe 5 to 10% of actual encounters due to the reporting pressures we just discussed. So every reported near-miss potentially represents 10 to 20 unreported incidents, where pilots experienced the same terrifying close approach, but chose not to file official reports because they didn't want the career complications that would follow. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates just how dangerous these encounters can be. March 2018, commercial flight operating between two major South American cities, cruising at 37,000 feet in clear weather conditions with excellent visibility. The captain is a 20-year veteran with over 15,000 flight hours. The first officer has 8,000 hours, and both are experienced professionals operating a modern wide-body aircraft with several hundred passengers aboard. They're in cruise phase, autopilot engaged, everything routine. Without warning, an object appears in their flight path approximately 200 feet ahead, close enough to see clearly, close enough that collision is imminent unless something changes immediately. The captain's training kicks in before his conscious mind fully processes what he's seeing. Disengage autopilot, initiate evasive maneuver, alert first officer and crew. The aircraft banks sharply, while the object, described later as a metallic sphere roughly 30 feet in diameter, passes within an estimated 40 to 50 feet of their port side. Think about that scenario from the passenger's perspective. You're sitting in your seat, maybe reading a book or watching a movie, expecting a boring routine flight. Suddenly the aircraft banks hard enough that loose items slide across cabin surfaces, and passengers without seatbelts fastened would be thrown sideways. No warning, no explanation over the intercom, just sudden violent manoeuvring at 37,000 feet. The flight attendants, who were mid-service with beverage carts in the aisles, scramble to secure equipment and check for injuries. Passengers are terrified, confused, demanding to know what happened. And the captain, after checking that the aircraft is stable and undamaged, faces the question of what to report. The truth: an unidentified metallic sphere appeared in our flight path and we had to take evasive action to avoid collision. Sounds absolutely insane and would trigger all the career complications we discussed. So what actually gets reported? Encountered unexpected severe turbulence requiring evasive manoeuvring to ensure passenger safety. Technically not a lie, but absolutely not the truth either, and passengers and aviation authorities remain completely unaware that they just experienced a near miss with an object exhibiting flight characteristics that shouldn't be possible. That encounter was reported anonymously to researchers years later, when the captain retired and no longer faced career consequences for being honest. How many similar encounters happen that we never hear about because the pilots involved are still flying and can't risk the professional fallout? How many times have you been on a flight that experienced sudden unexplained maneuvering and attributed it to turbulence or weather when actually the pilots were avoiding collision with something they couldn't identify? The numbers are unknowable precisely because the reporting system is designed to discourage honesty about these encounters, but the pattern of anonymous accounts suggests near misses are disturbingly common in commercial aviation, and we're systematically blind to them because acknowledging they happen would create questions nobody wants to answer. Let's talk about what happens if one of these near misses becomes an actual collision. A commercial wide-body aircraft typically weighs 400,000 to 900,000 pounds, depending on size and fuel load. It's travelling at 500 plus knots at 35,000 feet. Now introduce a 30 to 60 foot metallic object into that aircraft's flight path. What happens depends on where the collision occurs. Hitting an engine would likely cause catastrophic engine failure and potentially structural damage from debris. Hitting a wing could compromise flight control surfaces and fuel tanks. Hitting the fuselage could cause rapid decompression and structural failure. Any of these scenarios at altitude with hundreds of passengers aboard would be absolutely catastrophic. We're talking about potential loss of everyone on board, wreckage scattered across hundreds of square miles, and an investigation that would raise questions aviation authorities have been desperately trying to avoid. And here's the part that should make everyone deeply uncomfortable. We have zero ability to prevent these encounters. Our air traffic control systems are designed to manage known traffic. Aircraft that file flight plans, squawk proper transponder codes, and follow established procedures. They're not designed to detect or avoid objects that appear without warning, demonstrate instantaneous acceleration, and apparently don't care about collision avoidance protocols. Our traffic collision avoidance systems aboard aircraft are brilliant pieces of technology that have prevented countless mid-air collisions between conventional aircraft, but they only work if the other aircraft is transmitting the proper signals. Objects that don't show up on radar or show up intermittently, or demonstrate flight characteristics that make collision prediction impossible, effectively render TCAS useless. We're flying hundreds of thousands of passengers daily through airspace, where objects demonstrating technology we don't understand occasionally operate in ways that create collision risks, and we have no effective means of detecting, tracking, or avoiding them beyond pilot vigilance and luck. The FAA's response to this situation has been, to put it charitably, inadequate. When pilots report near misses with unexplained objects, the reports get filed, noted, and apparently disappear into administrative systems that aren't designed to handle observations that don't fit comfortable categories. There's no systematic investigation, no pattern analysis, no coordination with military authorities who might have additional sensor data from the same airspace and time periods. Just individual reports treated as isolated incidents despite clear patterns suggesting these are systematic encounters happening with disturbing frequency. And before you assume this is incompetence or bureaucratic inefficiency, understand that the FAA is staffed by competent professionals who are very good at their jobs when dealing with conventional aviation safety issues. The problem isn't capability, it's willingness to acknowledge a problem that doesn't have comfortable solutions. International aviation authorities face similar patterns and demonstrate similar reluctance to address them publicly. Civil aviation authorities in Europe, Asia, South America, and elsewhere receive reports of near misses with unexplained objects. They file the reports, and then nothing. No public acknowledgement, no safety bulletins warning pilots to be alert for anomalous traffic, no coordination with research institutions that might help understand what's being encountered. Just bureaucratic processing that treats each incident as an isolated anomaly, rather than recognizing the clear pattern of systematic aerial activity that creates ongoing safety risks. The result is collective institutional denial that serves nobody's interests except, perhaps, the narrow goal of avoiding uncomfortable public questions about what's operating in supposedly controlled and monitored airspace. Let's consider a thought experiment. What would happen if a commercial aircraft actually collided with one of these objects and the crash was catastrophic enough that hiding the cause became impossible? You'd have wreckage that potentially includes debris from the object. You'd have flight recorder data showing the seconds before impact. You'd have radar data from ground stations and possibly military sensors that tracked the encounter. You'd have potential eyewitnesses on the ground who saw the collision. The investigation would eventually have to acknowledge what happened, and that acknowledgement would raise every question aviation authorities have been avoiding. What are these objects? Where do they come from? How long have they been operating in our airspace? Why weren't we warned? What's being done to prevent future encounters? And the honest answers: we don't know, decades at minimum. You weren't warned because we've been systematically denying the problem exists, and we can't prevent future encounters because we don't understand what we're dealing with, would absolutely shatter public confidence in aviation safety and potentially in broader government competence. So the incentive structure creates a situation where authorities are motivated to maintain denial as long as possible, hoping that catastrophic collision somehow doesn't occur despite the ongoing near misses that suggest it's a matter of probability, rather than possibility. It's a strategy that works right up until it doesn't, and the consequences when it fails will be far worse than if the problem had been acknowledged and addressed proactively. But institutional incentives rarely optimize for long-term outcomes when short-term comfort is available. So we're collectively gambling that we can continue operating 100,000 flights daily through airspace with unexplained high-performance objects, and somehow avoid the collision that probability suggests is increasingly likely the longer this situation continues. The psychological impact on pilots who've experienced near misses can't be overstated. These are professionals whose entire careers are built on maintaining control, following procedures, and ensuring passenger safety. Having an object appear suddenly in their flight path, demonstrating impossible performance characteristics, and forcing emergency maneuvering to avoid collision creates trauma that many pilots struggle to process. They can't talk about it publicly without career consequences. They can't seek professional counseling without triggering medical evaluations that might ground them, and they can't even discuss it freely with fellow pilots without risking reputation damage. So they carry the experience alone, and each subsequent flight creates anxiety about whether today's the day another encounter occurs, whether next time they'll have enough warning to react, whether their passengers realize how close they came to disaster during that unexpected turbulence last month. And let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. If these objects wanted to cause collisions, they absolutely could. The fact that near misses remain near misses rather than actual collisions suggests either the objects are aware of human aircraft and actively avoiding catastrophic encounters despite coming dangerously close, or we've been extraordinarily lucky. The timing hasn't aligned for actual impact. Neither explanation is particularly comforting. If the objects are aware and avoiding collisions, that implies intelligence and intent, but raises questions about why they're operating so close to passenger aircraft in the first place. If it's just luck, then collision becomes a matter of statistical probability, and with thousands of encounters over decades, our luck should have run out already if timing and positioning were purely random. The scope of this potential safety crisis extends beyond just collision risk. Objects demonstrating instantaneous acceleration and hypersonic velocities create wake turbulence and atmospheric disturbance that could affect nearby aircraft even without direct collision. An object accelerating to thousands of miles per hour creates shockwaves and air displacement that, if encountered by a passenger aircraft, could cause loss of control, structural stress, or catastrophic failure depending on severity and aircraft. Condition. We've seen commercial aircraft suffer serious damage from encountering wake turbulence from other large aircraft miles away. Imagine the effects of encountering the wake from something accelerating to 10,000 miles per hour from a standing start within seconds. The forces involved would be unprecedented and potentially unsurvivable for conventional aircraft not designed to withstand such extreme atmospheric conditions. The uncomfortable truth is that we're operating global commercial aviation as if we have complete understanding and control of our airspace, when evidence suggests we have neither. Objects demonstrating technology beyond our current capabilities are operating in the same airspace as passenger flights. They're occasionally coming close enough to force evasive maneuvering, and our institutional response has been to pretend this isn't happening rather than acknowledge the problem and work toward solutions. That approach might delay uncomfortable questions, but it doesn't reduce risk, it doesn't improve safety, and it leaves passengers completely unaware that their flights are occasionally sharing airspace with phenomena we don't understand and can't control. At some point, probably when catastrophic collision eventually occurs despite everyone's hopes otherwise, we'll be forced to confront this reality. The question is whether we can start addressing it proactively before that happens, or whether it takes disaster to force the conversation that should have happened decades ago. Alright, we've covered individual encounters, established the 5 observables, explored why witnesses stay silent, and confronted the potential air safety crisis nobody wants to acknowledge. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because when you plot these encounters on a map and start analysing patterns, something emerges that's either deeply troubling or incredibly fascinating, depending on whether you prefer your reality comfortable or accurate. We're talking about global patterns in UFO activity that suggest intentional positioning rather than random distribution, and once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Start with the hotspots we've already discussed: South America's Pacific coast, Alaska's remote wilderness, and if we expand the scope to include well-documented cases from other regions, the east coast of the United States particularly around nuclear installations and military bases. On the surface, these seem like random geographic locations separated by thousands of miles with no obvious connection. Except there absolutely are connections, and they cluster around specific human activities in ways that suggest whoever or whatever is operating these objects has specific interests that aren't random curiosity. Lou Elizondo and the team that ran the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program noticed these patterns during their analysis of decades of encounter reports, and what they found should make everyone at least slightly uncomfortable about what's happening in supposedly controlled airspace. First pattern, commercial air routes. The encounters we've discussed aren't randomly distributed across global airspace. They cluster along major commercial flight corridors. South America's Pacific coast is a major route for flights between North and South American destinations. Alaska sits beneath Great Circle routes connecting North America and Asia, handling thousands of daily flights. The East Coast corridors serve transatlantic traffic between the Americas and Europe. If you're conducting observation or reconnaissance of human aviation operations, these routes provide consistent opportunities to observe aircraft at various altitudes, speeds, and operational conditions. It's like setting up an observation post along a highway rather than random country roads. You maximize your sample size and data collection efficiency by positioning where traffic concentration is highest. Second pattern, military installations, particularly those associated with advanced aerospace programs or strategic defense. Objects demonstrating impossible flight characteristics show up with disturbing frequency near Air Force bases, Navy facilities, and locations where cutting-edge military technology gets developed and tested. This isn't just anecdotal. Declassified military reports consistently show encounter clustering near installations like Nellis Air Force Base, White Sands Missile Range, and numerous other facilities where advanced aircraft and weapon systems operate. If your goal is assessing human military capabilities or monitoring technological development, these installations provide exactly the intelligence you'd want. The fact that security is tight and airspace is restricted doesn't seem to deter these objects at all, which either means they don't care about our security protocols or they're confident we can't do anything about their presence anyway. Neither explanation is particularly reassuring. Third pattern, and this one gets really uncomfortable: nuclear facilities. Power plants, weapon storage, missile sites, submarines carrying nuclear warheads. Encounters cluster around these locations at rates that suggest specific interest rather than coincidence. Multiple well-documented cases involve objects hovering over nuclear weapons storage facilities, pacing submarines during strategic deterrence patrols, and appearing at missile sites during periods of heightened alert status. Robert Salas, former Air Force officer, has extensively documented incidents where objects appeared over ICBM launch facilities and somehow interfered with the missile's electronic systems, rendering them temporarily inoperative. That's not casual observation. That's direct interaction with humanity's most destructive technology in ways that demonstrate either concern or capability assessment, or both. When you map these patterns globally, the picture that emerges looks less like random phenomenon and more like systematic surveillance operation. Objects appear where human activity is most concentrated or most strategically significant. They demonstrate awareness of military response by evading intercept attempts. They show apparent interest in our nuclear capabilities, and they've been conducting these operations consistently for decades at minimum. This isn't the behavior pattern of natural phenomenon or misidentified conventional aircraft. This is intelligence-driven activity with apparent objectives and methodology. Whether those objectives are benign scientific curiosity, strategic reconnaissance, or something else entirely remains unknown, but the pattern itself suggests purpose rather than randomness. And here's where we confront the question everyone wants answered but nobody can answer definitively. What do they want? If these objects are intelligently controlled, and the evidence strongly suggests they are given the purposeful behavior, tactical awareness, and systematic patterns, what's the goal? Why conduct decades-long observation of human aviation, military operations, and nuclear capabilities? What information are they gathering, and what do they plan to do with it? These questions venture into speculation because we simply don't have enough data to answer definitively, but we can explore theories based on observed behavior patterns and make educated guesses about motivation even while acknowledging uncertainty. Theory 1. Scientific observation. Maybe we're being studied the way we study wildlife, with researchers interested in understanding an intelligent species and its technological development. The close approaches to aircraft could be analogous to researchers tagging animals to study behavior, getting close enough to gather data while trying to minimize disruption to natural activity patterns. The interest in nuclear technology might reflect concern about a species acquiring capabilities for self-destruction or environmental catastrophe. This theory paints the observers as essentially neutral scientists conducting long-term study, which is relatively comforting if you ignore the part where we're the subjects being studied without consent or knowledge. Theory 2. Strategic surveillance. Maybe these objects represent reconnaissance operations by entities interested in assessing human technological capabilities for purposes we don't understand yet. The focus on military installations and nuclear facilities suggests particular interest in our defensive and offensive capabilities. The demonstrations of superior technology during intercept attempts could serve dual purposes: gathering data on our response capabilities while demonstrating technological superiority that makes clear any potential conflict would be extremely one-sided. This theory is less comforting because it suggests potential adversarial relationship, or at minimum assessment of humanity as potential threat or strategic concern. Theory 3. Environmental monitoring. Maybe the interest isn't in humanity specifically, but in Earth's biosphere and ecosystem, with particular concern about human activities that could damage or fundamentally alter the planet. Nuclear technology, industrial aviation, military operations, these all represent human activities with potential global environmental impacts. Objects might be monitoring these activities to assess rates of change, environmental damage, or potential catastrophic scenarios. This theory would explain the long-term nature of observation and the apparent interest in activities that have planetary scale implications, rather than just localized effects. Theory 4, and this one's deliberately provocative. Maybe some encounters aren't observation at all, but something closer to demonstration or messaging. Some encounters seem almost playful, objects performing aerobatic maneuvers that serve no obvious intelligence-gathering purpose, but definitely get witnessed and reported. Others seem aggressive or confrontational, approaching military aircraft in ways that clearly aren't trying to avoid detection. Maybe different encounters serve different purposes, or maybe we're witnessing communications attempts using demonstrations of capability as the message medium. Look what we can do that you can't might be the entirety of the message, or it might be invitation or warning or something else we're not interpreting correctly, because we don't share common communication frameworks. The uncomfortable possibility underlying all these theories is that we might be the ones being studied rather than doing the studying. Humanity generally assumes we're the intelligent observers analysing phenomenon around us, but these encounters flip that script. We're not the scientists with clipboards taking notes, we're the subjects exhibiting behaviours that someone else finds interesting enough to observe systematically across decades. That reversal challenges assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy of intelligence and technological capability, which is psychologically difficult for species that spent centuries assuming we're the pinnacle of intelligence in our immediate cosmic neighbourhood. Some encounter characteristics suggest varying levels of awareness about human observers. Objects that maintain distance and avoid close approaches might be trying to gather data, while minimizing disruption or detection. Objects that approach closely and demonstrate capabilities overtly might be intentionally showing us what they can do, either to study our reactions or to communicate their technological superiority. Objects that interfere with military systems might be testing capabilities or sending messages about human activities they find concerning. Without communication we can understand, all of this remains interpretation based on observed behavior, but the patterns suggest intelligence and intention rather than random phenomenon. So where does this leave us? We've got documented encounters spanning decades, witnessed by credible observers using professional equipment, demonstrating flight characteristics that violate our understanding of physics, clustering around locations of human strategic and technological significance, and suggesting intelligence-driven operations with purposes we don't fully understand. Former Pentagon officials like Luis Elizondo have gone public with information about government programs investigating these phenomena. Navy pilots have confirmed encounters through official channels. Civilian witnesses are increasingly willing to share experiences despite social stigma and professional risks. The silence that protected institutional denial is cracking, and while the answers remain elusive, the questions are finally being asked openly rather than whispered in private. What needs to happen for real progress in understanding this phenomenon? First, we need systematic data collection that's actually designed to document encounters rather than dismiss them. That means equipping aircraft with sensors specifically calibrated to detect and record anomalous objects, creating reporting systems that encourage honesty rather than punishing it, and coordinating between civilian aviation authorities, military, intelligence and research institutions to share data and identify patterns. The technology exists. Modern aircraft are flying sensor platforms that could collect comprehensive data on every encounter if anyone actually wanted comprehensive data instead of comfortable ignorance. Second, we need institutional support for witnesses rather than stigmatization. Pilots who report encounters should be thanked for contributing valuable observational data, not subjected to enhanced medical scrutiny that threatens their careers. Researchers studying this phenomenon should receive funding and academic legitimacy, rather than mockery and marginalization. The cultural shift from seeing UFOs means you're crazy to reporting anomalous observations is valuable contribution to scientific understanding would dramatically increase data quality and quantity by removing barriers that currently keep most witnesses silent. Third, we need honest acknowledgement from authorities that this phenomenon exists and represents genuine questions requiring investigation. Not vague statements about taking reports seriously while doing nothing substantive, but actual commitment of resources, expertise, and institutional credibility to understanding what's happening in our airspace. The FAA needs to acknowledge aviation safety implications and work towards solutions rather than pretending the problem doesn't exist. Military intelligence needs to declassify historical data that could help establish patterns and characteristics, not to satisfy public curiosity, but because understanding this phenomenon serves national security interests if these objects represent potential aerospace threats or intelligence-gathering operations by unknown parties. Fourth, And maybe most importantly, we need acceptance that sharing our skies with something we don't understand is the current reality whether we're comfortable with it or not. The evidence has reached critical mass. Denying these encounters happen requires dismissing too many credible witnesses, too much sensor data, too many independent corroborations across too many years and locations. Belief isn't required here. Evidence is sufficient. The question isn't, do you believe in UFOs, because that frames this as matter of faith rather than evidence-based conclusion. The question is, what are you going to do about documented observations of anomalous aerial phenomena that demonstrate technology beyond current human capabilities and operate in supposedly controlled airspace with apparent intelligence and purpose? This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter where we stop pretending and start investigating. The stigma is cracking, the silence is breaking, and the questions that should have been asked decades ago are finally being posed openly. We don't have all the answers yet, and honestly, we might not have satisfying answers for years or decades, depending on whether whoever operates these objects decides to make communication easier or continues observing from distance while demonstrating capabilities we can't match. But we're at least asking the right questions now, and that's progress from the institutional denial and cultural stigma that kept this conversation suppressed for so long. What happens next depends largely on whether we're willing to confront uncomfortable possibilities rather than retreating into comfortable denial. The evidence suggests we share our planet and our skies with intelligence that possesses technology we don't understand and apparently has interests in human activities we can't fully explain. That's either the most significant ongoing phenomenon in modern history, or it's mass delusion affecting trained military personnel, experienced commercial pilots, and civilian contractors across multiple continents over multiple decades. One of these explanations requires accepting that our understanding of what's possible needs updating. The other requires believing that thousands of independent, credible witnesses are all either mistaken or lying, which seems more likely given the evidence we've examined. The next time you're on a commercial flight cruising at 35,000 feet, maybe take a moment to look out the window and consider that the pilots flying your aircraft might have seen things they can't talk about publicly. That the airspace you're traveling through might be shared with objects demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't be possible. That the comfortable assumption that humanity fully understands and controls Earth's airspace might be substantially less accurate than aviation authorities would prefer you believe. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Maybe learning that we're not alone in our skies, that technology exists beyond our current capabilities, that intelligence operates on scales we're only beginning to grasp. Maybe that's not terrifying crisis, but fascinating opportunity to expand our understanding of what's possible and where humanity fits in the larger picture of cosmic intelligence and technological development. The question isn't whether you believe. The question is whether you're ready to accept that the comfortable certainties about what flies in our skies might need significant revision based on evidence that's been accumulating for decades while we collectively looked the other way. And if you've watched this far, I'm going to assume the answer is yes. Welcome to the new reality, where the skies are substantially more interesting and considerably less controlled than we've been telling ourselves. What we do with that reality, whether we investigate honestly or retreat into denial, whether we demand transparency or accept continued obfuscation, that's up to us. But the phenomenon isn't waiting for our comfort level to catch up. It's been here, it's still here, and it's not asking permission to operate in airspace we thought was exclusively ours. Time to decide whether we're ready to acknowledge that and start asking the questions that matter.